My name is Carol Ann Carey, and I am the host of Psychic Flow here on SocietyBytesRadio.com. We are very excited today to have an distinguished guest, Karen Frances McCarthy, MA, who is a published author and public speaker. Please join us today while we delve into the metaphysical, the magical, and the mystical. We are very honored to have this special guest. Karen, welcome to our show. It is wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you, Caroline. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. You were formerly a political journalist who now focus on spirituality, belief systems, and the philosophy of religion. Your work is absolutely astounding. I have to say, I had read Love, Sex, and Death, printed in Salon.
Yes.
And it really touched me because I had a similar experience. And I was wondering, which we will get to when I get through your accolades, how that touched upon and turned you to your spiritual beliefs. That is how I knew you. I first was introduced to your work was through your spirituality, through Huffington Post and BeliefNet and Salon. But you are very well known as a journalist who was in Iraq as a war correspondent and for writing for the Irish Times, Times Union, and the News Tribune. You covered U.S. politics for Irish Examiner and wrote a daily report for Al Jazeera. As an author, your book, which I was pouring through last night, The Other Irish, was supported by Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs as a cultural outreach in an effort to, I would assume, soothe the cross-border peace process, and you received a lot of attention from BBC, the Huffington Post, and many other TV, radio, and print. Also, in television, you produced 2 documentaries with Deepak Chopra of his stories, The Crystal Cave and Alchemy, The Art of Spiritual Transformation. I also had a chance to glance at Made in America about immigrants, focusing on the challenges of the human spirit. That also received an Irish Film and Television Award nomination for Best Documentary Series. You're a graduate of the London School of Journalism. You have an MA from University College in Dublin, and you are currently preparing for a PhD in religious studies. You are also working on a new nonfiction book about science and religion and the search for truth. And if that isn't enough, you're a much acclaimed and spectacular medium, which is how I first was introduced to your biography and your accomplishments. So today we have part 1 and part 2. Part 1, we're going to discuss some of these accomplishments here, your journalism, your writing. In part 2, I hope to delve more into your belief and how we can move forward with science and spirituality, and of course about your new book. So listeners, please stay tuned for that part 2, which will follow this one a week later. So Karen, please talk to me about how you came as a child into your belief system and what happened. Can you delve into, and you were born in Dublin.
Yeah. Well, and I wrote some of this in that Salon article that you talked about, and I'm really glad you enjoyed it. It was actually quite a difficult article to write about because it was almost like coming out as a medium for me. I was born and raised in Dublin, and I came to the States in my early 20s. But I was, I was raised Catholic the way you do, and sort of lapsed. By the time I was 17, I had sort of lapsed, and by the time I was in my mid-20s, was the confirmed atheist. And, it's just, I suppose, part of growing up. And also things were changing in the religious fabric of Ireland as well. And the idea of sort of taking on board everything that was handed to us by the nuns and the priests was starting to sort of fall away. And there really has been a huge falling away from the church in Ireland currently. But anyway, that was a long time ago. But for me, it was a long time ago. But as a child, I used to see and have conversations with, spirits. Only I didn't really know there were spirits. I try to think back now and try to remember, did I know the person was a spirit or did I think they were alive? And I think I knew Well, I mean, they obviously were alive because we're all alive, right? And we die and we continue on, which is, I know, something we'll talk about later. But as a child, I was aware that the person in front of me in the room wasn't alive in the same sense I was or my mother was. But they didn't, I wasn't scared. I would just have these conversations. Sometimes people would come who I didn't know, and I would feel so bad because I knew they were trying to say something or they looked sad or whatever, and I didn't know them and I didn't know how to help them. But my mother used to think, my mother would get a fright, because she'd see me having a conversation as a 3-year-old with somebody standing in the hall or something out the doorway. And, there were times where she thought somebody had broken into the house and I was talking to them. But and she would say, like, who are you talking to? And I'd say that man or, Nana, whoever. And I was able to, it turned out that I was only 3 years old, but some of these people I was talking to were long dead relatives that I was talking to by name that I wouldn't have 3 or 4 years old known. They were long gone, great grandmother and stuff. But my mother anyway somehow reconciles this as an imaginary friend. Now, I know my mother had some experiences that she never spoke about. And I found out much later that 2 of my aunts had a lot of these experiences. But one of my aunts in particular had experiences, but I think they made her nervous. So she saw sort of somebody in the living room, she would just run out into the street, So she, obviously wasn't very keen or very open to the idea, even though she did see them too. But, they stop, after a while they stop. I mean, I do know now, looking back, that there were actually these sorts of things continued more or less throughout my life. But at the time, I sort of wrote them off. Either it was an auditory hallucination, or my eyes were tired, or whatever the case may be. But I got to, the person I was got engaged to, we had just this person I was seeing, wonderful man. He and I had decided to get married there many, many, many years later. This is about 7 or 8 years ago, and almost 8 years ago now. And 7 weeks after we got engaged, I mean, he's just an amazing person. The 7 weeks after we got engaged, I had gone down south to do some research for a book from some stories I was working on. And he died suddenly while I was away. And I stayed in the south. I just couldn't face New York. And all sorts of things started happening that I sort of touched on, a few of these in that salon story. Electronics turning on and things moving and my shoulders being squeezed and all sorts of things were going on. And gradually, initially thinking I had gone out of my mind with grief or something. Yeah. Which was very unusual for me because I really wasn't, I was a fairly sort of strong-minded individual. I mean, I'd been in some fairly hairy situations in my time. And, I'd been in Iraq during the war. We had been tiptoeing around through IED territory. We'd been shot at. I'd grown up in Ireland. I'd spent some time in Northern Ireland in the 80s. And, as you mentioned, I wrote that book, which was contributed to the cultural outreach, which was part of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And so I was very, very unnerved to think that maybe I was losing my mind after all of that over this. And I ended up coming across, of all people, a Catholic priest who actually helped me sort of understand, oh no, these things has happened to many parishioners, which was a kind of ironic in the end that it was a Catholic priest that was the one who was able to say, these things happened. And so I started investigating what was going on, and I did an awful lot of research and reading and went to the Edgar. I was actually in Virginia, which was an interesting place to be. There were some spiritualist churches there. The Edgar Casey Center is there in Virginia Beach. the University of Virginia has the parapsychology department. I think the Monroe Institute is down there. I'm actually working on a memoir about this at the moment. It's open on my screen in front of me, and it's almost like I felt like Virginia was like the Area 51 of the paranormal. It was just like this area where there was so much going on. I just happened to be there at the time. And so it was a very, very steep learning curve, because just intellectually I kind of needed to understand what was going on. It was a very sharp turn to make from atheism. And, it's a long, long, long time since I was 4 years old. So it was a very sharp turn to make from sort of atheism back to this, and to realizing what had gone on, and to remembering what had happened as a child, and to sort of going back through things that happened in life that I had to sort of then reframe and realize what these things had been going on. They weren't auditory hallucinations, for example. There's and so it came eventually. The penny dropped that through very, very helpful and very compassionate people who were very willing to help. One was Professor Louis Legrand, who wrote a really great book called Love Lives On, which I read, which was a really nice book he put together about the signs that loved ones show us when we're bereaved. He was a grief counsellor. And I met some very interesting people who really, really helped me on my way, and ended up eventually realizing, after about a month or so of the bed shaking and the stairs creaking and the radio turning on, and all sorts of stuff, which will be in this memoir, that that was actually him.
Wow.
And once I got my head around that and just accepted what had been going on and what it was, then I realized, oh, this is not just him. I can actually communicate with anybody. And so, I was very unsettled by the whole idea of mediumship. I'd never, first as an atheist, I thought it was, naturally delusional for many, many years. And so all of a sudden now I'm this person, and so just even having to come to terms with that was a journey in and of itself. And I gradually came to it. It just got to the point where there was just no denying it. I mean, there was too many things happening. There were too many people talking to me that I didn't know, and giving messages that were meaningful to other people I didn't know. And so I decided in the end that I really wanted to, if I was going to actually get on board with this and do something with it, that I really wanted to make sure I did it well and I did it ethically. And so I started actually training. I spent a lot of time at the Arthur Findlay College, just outside London there, and did a lot of training there. And I actually have I've done, there are 4-year programs, so I have 3 certificates of recognition now from the Arthur Findlay College in mediumship and healing and speaking. And so, that was very, very accelerated. I think Nancy Ubel, who's a past life regressionist at the Edgar Cayce Center, she said I was on this fast track. It was like Spirit World had put me back on this fast track after all these years of neglecting it. All of a sudden, there it was. So, it's been very, very interesting. So of course, these things are life-changing. And when you have these experiences, then and I know you talked about, my former work as a journalist and political journalist. I just didn't want to do it anymore. Covering politics, I just ended up not being right for me anymore. There was something else I had seen in the world, and one of my editors had asked me to cover not the last election, the one before that, and I was like, I just can't, I just can't do it. I feel like I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, and nothing is really changing. And there are people out there far better equipped than me to deal with issues that are meaningful to me, like the environment and and just human rights and stuff. And this was an area that was unique to me, which was sort of our spiritual well-being. And so I shifted tracks really then and started focusing more on writing about religion and spirituality and trying to find a language. And I know this is something we'll probably talk about later when we talk about the Science and Spiritualism initiative I've started with the college. But I felt that what I actually started finding was that, and I was doing a lot of lectures and I was giving talks like a case center in various different places. And what I was finding from people coming up to me afterwards was that there seemed to be a real need for people to be able to get on board with these concepts, but in a way they could get on board. So a lot of people couldn't get on board through organized religion. There were a lot of things in their sort of religion of origin, so to speak, that really weren't consistent with their own logic or their own experiences. And at the same time, a lot of people couldn't get on board with the New Age movement because it was, talking about angels and talking about auras and a lot of the things that are distilled and used by the New Age movement was just too much of a leap for a lot of people who are trying to get their head around and wanted to be able to believe. It was too much of a leap from them, from where they were, to going that far into that sort of speak and that sort of territory. But people really wanted to be able to have this presented to them and these ideas presented to them in a language that made sense to them, in a normal language, using, where they didn't have to learn this whole other energy language or whatever, and so people started talking to me more and more and asking me more and more about this. And so I started sort of addressing this. I started talking about these things more. And I know I've just been listening to Eben Alexander's book, not Proof of Heaven. He's got a new one out, The Map of the Heavens, I think it's called. And the first couple of chapters in that are what I'm talking about, I think. It's just, there are other people out there trying to find a language also to be able to talk about these ideas and the meaning of continued existence, but not in a very unreachable or inaccessible spiritual sort of way. I'll say that for want of a better word. But in a way that just sort of practically makes sense. And the more you look at the sort of nature of our own world, and I'm not for 1 minute saying that science proves the afterlife. I'm absolutely not saying that, because the language of science doesn't lend itself to this. But when you look at the work that scientists are doing, and that even themselves are saying, like, our understanding, or what we thought we understood of this world, is actually so unlike what this world is really like, it really raises questions, or it really opens the door to start to look at other ideas around concepts, for example, such as consciousness, which is really what spiritualism is about. It's about the survival of consciousness. And we start to see that there are these like little areas where science is sort of inching around the edge one way, and spiritualists and are inching around their edge another way, and that there may not be that much of that. There may not be the sort of chasm, an impassable chasm between science and spirituality that we have thought there was up until now. That there may be, and you cannot obviously prove at least not now, that the soul survives, that there is heaven, that there is God, because the language of science to prove anything means it must be repeatable, it must be measurable, it must fulfill all these criteria that obviously don't apply to anything to do with spirituality. But I think just even questioning and understanding the nature of this existence just shows us that the idea of a discarnate existence, the idea of of our consciousness existing separate from our brain, isn't really not that far-fetched. And so I think when we look at it in those terms, it becomes much, much easier for ordinary people who are not particularly spiritual, certainly don't want to get caught up in, angels and auras and crystals and all this kind of stuff. That, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, I'm just saying it doesn't work for everybody. Is that this makes it very plausible. And I feel that the more we can find this language to be able to bridge that gap, the more people will be able to see there is something greater than this. And I think our understanding of something greater than this, or understanding that we are a part of something greater than this, affects our choices and how we live here. And that's, I think, it's not just about understanding that we survive, or it's not just about understanding that our loved ones are still there and helping us. And that is so important when we're bereaved, of course. And it's just so important in our lives to know that we are still cared for and loved and we're not alone. But I think as a society, it would make a difference if we were to understand the larger scope of the nature of reality, or the nature of our existence, or the nature of our continued existence.
Would you feel that the way I'm looking at your story and some of my mild experiences compared to yours prepared me to do this kind of work? I think that you have to experience loss yourself, and everyone does, and to really grasp what that means to people. And also your experience writing about Iraq and seeing death every day and danger every day and bravo every day and courage must have contributed, I would think. Would you say it did? It contributed to why we are here, what mark we make, how important it is, our role, and what prepares us for the next life? Does that make sense?
You mean how the total? Well, I think that I'm not a great believer, although, and I've seen lots of evidence to the contrary, but I'm holding fast to my idea that that everything is not predetermined. I do think, right, though, that our experiences, we do have a choice in how we respond to our experiences, and how our experiences impact us and what we do with them. And I do think there's a sort of an irony in the fact that the more we lose, and it doesn't go for everyone, obviously, but for most people, the more we lose, the more we want to help and serve, which is, it's sort of, you would think it would be the opposite. The more we lose, the more mean we get, or the greedier we get, or whatever. But strangely enough, there is something about loss that I think seems to make a lot of people, most people, I would say, more compassionate, more sensitive to suffering, and more desirous to help other people who are suffering. And so I hope I answered your question, but I would say the totality of my own experience, I think, has sort of led me step by step towards realizing that there is a need to understand what we're part of, and there is a need to try to communicate that, and there is a need to try to help people, because ultimately, we're all suffering in one way or another, and we've only really got each other to try to ease that.
I had read in one of your biographies, of which there are a few, your websites, which I wanted to mention that. We're at the 2-minute mark, so I do want to bring that up. KarenFMcCarthy.com is one, and the other one is Celtic Circle, correct?
It's not KarenFrancisMedium.com.
Oh, Karen Francis Medium. Mm-hmm. And so you have two of them going. I think that was the first one that I had seen was your mediumship. But I did want to point out in one of the biographies, it did say that even at an earlier age, you felt a desire to be of service. And I think that your career has proven that in so many aspects, with your work on Northern Ireland and your articles about bereavement and your studies at Arthur Findlay and becoming a Reiki master, and talking about what I love about your writing style, which is phenomenal to me.
Thank you.
Is just how it reaches in and grabs you. I mean, it's very hard not to identify with what you're writing, because we've been there. So you just deliver it beautifully. So I think that you certainly have completed that mission. If that was your mission here,
Thank you.
I think you've certainly done that. I want to point out to our listeners that we do have a part 2 coming up, and with Karen, which is fabulous, regarding your new book and more about blending science and spirituality. Can you give us a little bit of a taste of what your new book, your no nonfiction, is going to be about?
Well, I'm working on two at the moment. I'm working on what I wanted to do was do a little book on sort of science and religion. And being Irish, I decided I would do that in the context of Irish science, which has been a phenomenal history and long neglected. But we have
Uh-huh.
it's a sort of an interesting combination because we're not known for science. We're sort of known for being religious.
Uh-huh.
We've had some, remarkable stories of remarkable scientists who were able to practice their own spiritual beliefs. Like Ernest Walton was the first man to split the atom, which is very little known. He was an
Mm,
Irishman. And he was a Methodist. And Erwin Schrödinger, who was the father of quantum physics, was an Irish citizen. He lived in Ireland for 17 years. He became an Irish citizen there. He headed up the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies. And he was a firm believer in Vedanta and the idea that, like a lot of the fathers of quantum physics, that science alone could not explain human consciousness. And so there is a remarkable, we've also got a 5,000-year-old astronomical observatory called Newgrange, which is a World
right.
Heritage Site now. So 5,000 years ago, they were combining astronomy with engineering. And, so it's very sort of been neglected Irish history in this. So I decided to write a book and sort of use that as a platform to explore how people through the ages had these brilliant minds who were very rational and logical in their thinking and interested in understanding the nature of the universe, were also able to combine that successfully with their religious and spiritual beliefs.
Thank you, Karen. We look forward to part two, where we get to delve into more of this topic with you. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for listening, and remember to stay tuned to part two. Thank you.